Nazi arguments to promote conservatism. Interesting. That seems a little hyperbolic to me. This is from the Cavernacle. A little hyperbolic to me, but I'm curious about the perspective. I'm curious about because as a New Yorker, we say some wild stuff all the time. So, sometimes, we'll filter it down. We water everything down somebody says. Somebody could be like, hey, you start yelling at you, like, okay, like, that's just normal here. So, like, you just don't take it personally. So maybe that's what it is. Let's do it, baby.
And colonization and settling of this conquest and colonization and settling of this land was overall a good and noble and courageous.
I wouldn't say any of those. I would say that, like, sorry, indigenous people, you skill issue. No, I wouldn't say that. I would say, like, hey, it's something that's bad that happened. It's not a noble thing to colonize, but it happened, and, like, let's kind of move forward. But in the context, like, you can't just genociding people was, like, it's not a noble thing. It's wild.
It is good that it happened, and we should be grateful.
I don't know about that.
The people who came here and claimed this land were heroes.
Wow.
It was heroic. And they were heroes not because of the other good stuff, but because they came and claimed it.
So hello everyone from the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and today
I'm
we're
turn myself
talking
down a
about
bit.
the opposite of socialism. We are talking about fascism, in particular, how the American conservative movement is fascist,
More
and we're
like
going to be focusing
bastism.
on some of the rhetoric you'll hear on one of the biggest online conservative networks, the Daily Wire. Now, a lot of you guys, I'm sure most people, would have watched World War II media, particularly TV shows and films, or even read some books about it. And I'm sure, like me, a lot of you often ask yourselves, like, what would I have done in this situation? What would I have done if I was alive during Nazi Germany?
We probably would have all followed whatever the status quo was. I'm not trying to be rude, but that's probably what we would have done. Unfortunately, we would have just put our heads down and tried to stay alive, baby. It's an unfortunate thing.
Could so many people go along with the Nazi agenda? How could so many people be complicit in one of the worst slaughters of human beings, which mainly focused on Jews, but also gay people, lesbian people, trans people, Romani people, basically every minority the Germans didn't like? Like, how could so many people go along with that? And if you ask your average American, I'd say even if you ask your average American conservative, what do they think of the Nazis? They would say the Nazis were bad, right? Though there seems to be some sort of understanding in society, and even conservative spaces in the West, that Nazism is bad, Hitler was bad, and you wouldn't go along with that agenda. If you had been in Nazi Germany with all your conservative allies, you would have stood up to the fascists. But we all know that's pretty much a fantasy at this point, because it's pretty clear that a lot of American conservatives...
Well, no, this is like two different questions. The question of, like, how do you feel about it now versus, like, what would you have done back then is totally different. If we were Germans living in Germany back then, we probably would have done some pretty bad things, because we would probably be part of the group that got manipulated into thinking what was happening was, like, righteous and good. That's just the reality. We want to pretend that we would be back. I'd be one of the good ones back then. We wouldn't be. It's a sad thing, too. I don't say that because it's an LOL funny. I say that because it's just kind of like a practicality. It's just kind of the reality of the situation, honestly, and it's just a sad reality. So,
have no clue what Nazism or fascism even is, and their opposition to it only stems from this historic framing of World War II, because they actually agree on a whole host of issues with the Nazis. I read some speeches from Joseph Goebbels, and even if you read some of Mein Kampf, I bet if you read some Hitler or Goebbels quotes to American conservatives and said it was said by Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis, they would probably agree with it. And the thing is, fascism can take many different forms. And I don't necessarily want to conflate Nazism with fascism, because yes, they are the same thing, but fascism can also take many different forms. Not all fascism is going to look like 1930s and 1940s Germany. And we see this through other examples, like Mussolini's Italy, while had similarities, wasn't the same. Franco's Spain, various fascist dictatorships during the Cold War period. Not all these places look the same. Not all these people carried out the same level of violence in terms of genocide, like the Holocaust, for example. I think that education of Nazi Germany and fascism in general means, as a Western population, we are really not ready to cope with the level of fascism. So at the moment, I would say the UK government is going in a fascist direction. You can see this through their xenophobic rhetoric. You can see this through its anti-refugee policies. You can see this with their crackdown on protest and freedom of speech. And you can even see this through the right-wing shift of the Labour Party, whose only criticism of the government seems to be they're not actually doing fascism efficiently enough. But then
it's interesting, though, because even in America, I see some of the right going in, like, a way. I don't use the word fascist or use, like, Nazi adjacent language, because I just think it's so cringe. I know it sounds like, but everybody calls everybody Nazis, so it makes me like be like, okay, this is a little cringe. But realistically speaking, I mean, when you do look at it, the conservatives are kind of going in that direction in America. First of all, there's a much weird high like value for Russia when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Now, I can understand if you're like, hey, like I think we should use those resources for us. If you think that, like, I get where you're coming from. I disagree on the level that like Russia's trying to take over Germany, and that's an ally, and like Russia is antithetical to like American freedoms. That's really what it comes down to for me. And it's a country that wants to maintain their own sovereignty, and like I think that we should help them do that. We disagree. That's perfectly fine and reasonable, but that's my perspective more than anything else on that. But there's people that are just like almost like, oh well, Russia has a claim, blah 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 blah, and there's like a lot of conservative speech that's like that values Russia in a weird way. They're like, Putin's a real man, shit like that, which is fucking weird. How Russia's better because they don't give in to like the LGBTQ, which, and just being anti-LGBTQ is anti-American. I don't know what to tell you. You can think it's weird all you want, but it's weird. Freedom of speech and expression extends to gay people sucking each other's dicks. Just so you know that. There's been conservatives that have tried to stop gay marriage from happening, like last year before it was codified. Like Ted Cruz was one of them that wanted to make it so that they couldn't get married, and that you could like revoke the marriage certificates and shit. It's fucking wild. Even like, not for nothing, even when it comes to like drag, like I know it's drag people are weird, and there's some sexualized drag people that shouldn't be doing the stuff in front of children, but then there's just some drag people that want to do drag in front of kids and like, or specifically read to kids in drag. It's weird, but like as long as they're not too sexualized, and most of them aren't, who cares? That is part of their freedom of speech. And there's like this obsession in America with like some of these more like conservatives. They're just blocking every policy progressives want to pose. They're not coming up with solutions for any of our real problems, like our income disparity, healthcare, poverty, homelessness, the housing crisis. They don't give a fuck. And it's like, holy shit, like what happened? You know, it's fucking bananas, bro. It's fucking badonkers. So like, yeah, I feel like the Republican Party in America and conservatism isn't bad fundamentally. You know, it's the good idea to the way that I look at the relationship is that progressives want to move forward and conservatives don't. But there's a positive in doing that, because if you move forward more slowly, you can make sure you take the right step, right? You know, if we just go too far and we're like, let's just completely destroy our healthcare right now to make it all private or make it all public healthcare, that's not a good idea. But like, hey, maybe we take a step back and we do something a little slower. I would like to see the conservative solutions to any of these problems. They're just not there. It seems like conservatives are just interested in saying LOL no to everything. So
a lot of people will say, well, hang on, we're not fascist. Fascism is Nazi Germany. We have an Asian prime minister. We have an Asian home secretary. We have a black foreign secretary. How could you say this is fascist? And I've actually made a couple of videos on this, that the new fascism in the West isn't necessarily white supremacist, like Nazi style. It's Western chauvinist fascism, which can be a bit multicultural. And there's no doubt the American conservative movement also subscribe to this Western chauvinist fascism, because it isn't as clear cut as saying American conservatism is a Nazi movement. It's more accurate to say it's a fascist movement. But today's video, I actually want to focus on the areas where they actually are just recycling Nazi propaganda and Nazi rhetoric, and I want to focus on Matt Walsh and Michael Knowles. Of course, both of them have basically called for the eradication of transgender people, but at the same time, with Matt Walsh, I want to focus on him basically saying the genocide of Native Americans and the slavery of African Americans was actually a good thing, make America a great country. And of course, we're also going to talk about Michael Knowles talking about eradicating transgender people, and how in the case—
you know what's interesting though about Michael Knowles? I found this clip and I saved it because I was like waiting for a moment to bring it up. And I just want to bring this up because he's speaking hard facts here. Just watch this clip from Michael Knowles.
Of course, and also there aren't that many transgender people. You know, the statistic for a long time was, I think it was 0.2% of the population, or even less. Now that some surveys say that number is 0.6% of the population, I think. Obviously, there are differing numbers because it's such a small population. And yet, it's all anyone's talking about. And I do think that the left has made us so reactionary on this. You know, reactionary. They do this.
I love Blair White just sucking his dick. What's funny about this to me, though, is that he's acknowledging that, like, this isn't the big issue. And I think that there's a level of truth to it being because the left is making them reactionary. But I also think there's a level of truth that conservatives have nothing left except trans weird. I understand when it comes to kids, like, things are a little, like, I get it. It's an uncomfortable topic. But it's mostly just LOL trans weird. That's really what it boils down to from what I'm seeing. So you know, it's, you know, he knows that this is a niche issue, and this is all conservative shit about. So,
case of Matt Walsh with the native stuff, this is the type of rhetoric which inspired the Nazis in the first place to carry out a similar colonization program in Eastern Europe. And of course, in terms of getting rid of transgender people or transgender ideology, the Nazis also targeted trans people and the LGBT community as a whole. But before we go any further, this video will definitely be demonetized. If you want to support my work, support me doing
maybe
videos like this where I talk about like very, very controversial things, consider becoming a patron. I'm trying to build up as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible.
Like it won't be
benefits are getting access to my Switch friend code and the Discord server. Also got some travel videos up on there, so if you care about any of that stuff, go check it out. So before we get into the specific clips and subjects, I just kind of want to talk more about like Nazism in the popular imagination. So I think the reason people don't really understand what Nazism, however you want to say it, is because the history of the Holocaust is taught really, really poorly. The history of Nazi Germany is taught really poorly. And the history of the Western problems of Nazi Germany is really taught poorly, because in the Western imagination, Hitler is some unique evil, and the Nazis have no similarities to any other group at the time. They simply emerged on the back of this destroyed German economy from World War I and the Wall Street crash, and capitalized on people's prejudices, which really like shot them to power. And then, you know, they created this genocidal state, built a whole economy that was based on theft and colonization. And in that, we have people like Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill, people might even say, is a anti-fascist, which is absolutely ridiculous. But because he led the fight in Britain against the Nazis, we have this popular view that the British elite were anti-Nazi. They completely hated the ideology of fascism, of white supremacy, and America did as well. America got into the war because it was also an anti-fascist nation, which is completely laughable when the American legal system inspired the Nazi legal system, and Hitler took so much inspiration of the genocides in America for the genocides he carried out. These things aren't...
It's like actively, did he? Is that true? Like what? Like with Native Americans and shit? Interesting. And I saw this clip from this. I think it's called Hunter. It's a show about like Nazi Jewish people who hunt Nazis in America. It was interesting. I think Al Pacino's in it, and I stopped watching, so it got fucking really boring and annoying after like episode 6. I don't know. It became too like it got too like preachy. Like it got too like, I don't know. Like it was just like annoying. It wasn't horrible, but anyway, apparently in that universe, Hitler's alive, and they put him on trial. I only watched like a bit of a clip on TikTok of this part, and he was basically like, "Okay, why you guys don't give a fuck what we did? You guys fucking did Native Americans and stuff like that." And I was like, "Interesting point." You know, I wonder what Hitler was alive, if he was alive, what he would actually say.
Generally understood in our understanding of the war.
Amazon Prime.
And just like with World War I, in essence, what World War II is a war between major colonial powers. And the reason Winston Churchill hated Hitler so much was more based on personal differences and him hating Germans and hating German colonization and Germany challenging the British Empire, rather than so much hating genocide, because Churchill was also responsible for killing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in India, Ireland, and various different colonies. So let's not pretend someone like that really cares about anti-fascism. And it also goes without saying the anti-communist aspect of the Holocaust, which was firmly intertwined with anti-Semitism because of things like Judeo-Bolshevism, with Hitler and the Nazis believing communism was a Jewish plot to undermine Western civilization and actually take over the world. We don't talk about that so much because the history of the war and the history of the period was allowed to be written by actual German generals who fought the Soviets, so they were able to characterize basically the Soviets as just as bad as the Nazis, these Mongol hordes who only beat the Nazis because they didn't care about human life. They threw every soldier at the Germans.
Yeah, I think it's called Hunters on Amazon Prime or something like that.
Without any weapons. And of course, they raped and murdered their way across Eastern Europe and to Berlin, and they were literally evil. Of course, because of the Cold War, they're trying to characterize the Soviets as basically the Nazis. And that went hand in hand with the Allied rehabilitation of West Germany to try and get British people, French people, European people to accept helping a German nation just after Germans had destroyed the whole of Europe. And you have people like Rommel being rehabilitated to seem like a good guy because they needed a figurehead to show, oh, not all Germans liked Hitler, not all Germans went along with him. Even though Rommel did both, it's only because he was implemented in the plot to kill Hitler, which he had no idea about, that they actually tried to rehabilitate his image. And I think what this all does is that a lot of Western countries kind of put fascism into a box. Fascism is in the past. Fascism was defeated in 1945, and then communism was defeated, almost as bad as fascism, in 1991, so we're just putting that all away. But unlike many countries, Germany specifically, that have had to reconcile with their awful genocidal past, the United States of America has not had to reconcile with its genocidal past. There is no education program across the United States which is like Germany's when it comes to things like the Holocaust, despite the fact one of the worst modern genocides was actually done to the Native Americans.
That's interesting. That's an interesting point, because I guess that is true. We never really kind of settled that, did we? I mean, black people are equal now, but obviously so are indigenous people. but we don't really have these robust educational programs. I remember when it came to my learning of like the Native American shit, is that like everything was kind of cool. We were kind of chilling, you know. Everybody, we all kind of liked each other. We were all happy. We were all happy with the trade. No biggie, no harm, no foul kind of thing. Turns out, not necessarily the truth. That might be a little bit worse than that, you know. Oh fuck, I'm still coughing a little bit. I think it's going on to talk too much. So, you know, we haven't really done too much to rectify these issues. You know, if we could rectify these issues and start to get things back into, which I think mostly is going to centralize around at this point, dealing with the poverty issue more than anything else. But if we can kind of rectify those issues, I'm thinking maybe we won't. The racism will be gone. We'll have less issues. We'll have less complaining. You know what I mean? Once it becomes a thing of the past, I don't think it is. I don't think slavery or segregation is enough of a thing of the past. I think since we're still feeling those negative impacts, like it's not a thing of the past still. We're not there yet. You know, if we want to get there, we got to put actual work into it.
By the American government, right? Often Americans aren't just not taught about this. This type of thing is celebrated. And one person in mainstream conservative circles who celebrates the native genocide of millions of people, the killings and slavery of millions of African people as well, is Matt Walsh, one of the most prominent creators, prominent speakers on the Daily Wire. And recently he went viral again because he was saying, America was good, and it's good we did these things to create this good nation. So what we're going to do is look at these clips, look at his...
Yeah, and I actually watched this other video. I was watching it, like, by myself last night. Are you serious, guys? I didn't watch it for content. It was actually a video by Big Joel. And, like, I know he's a little bit of a liberal cuck.
Hey, everybody.
I'm going to put it in the description. But I've been kind of enjoying his stuff. He's pretty straightforward. He doesn't not have a big pander or anything. He's just pretty chill. And he made this video about PragerU kids, and the way that they talk about shit is fucking wild. Like, it's actually makes my wiener explode. So I would recommend watching the video on your own time. I put it in the description. But it's like weird the way that they talk about like these issues. Like they justify it. There's one point where they allude that like slavery isn't even a moral evil. I was like, what the fuck? It's so bizarre.
Rhetoric. I'm also going to link it to modern conservatism because Ayn Rand said something extremely similar about killing most native peoples in America. And then I want to talk about how this type of rhetoric and belief in America at large, during its whole history, actually inspired Hitler and his own ideology in Eastern Europe. So Matt Walsh has described himself as a theocratic fascist, and I think he originally did this to troll people, but this guy just is a fascist. There is no debate about it, and I strongly think he...
Man, I sure am glad we stole this land. Beautiful. Like, it's so weird, because, like, here's the thing. I think that, like, a lot of us, and you might say that this is too much of an American perspective, whatever, like, we did what we did, and it is what it is. We can't give the land back. We are where we are, right? Unfortunately, it's been historically proven that throwing bodies at things, you know, ends up resulting in a positive or not a positive outcome, a technological outcome, and that's kind of where we are. We've got a lot of shitty things and we can't change it. But there's a difference between like my perspective, like, yeah, it sucks, let's just try to move forward better, versus like going and be like, haha, lol, look at this land we stole, we're so fucking base, like look at all these native people we killed, because that's the implication there. It's fucking justifiable and based, and it's like that's just such an antagonistic perspective, and you're obviously looking to upset people. Like, that's loser shit. It's kind of pathetic, don't you think? You know?
Wouldn't actually disagree with much of the Nazis' own ideology, even if he might disagree with some of their actions, if I want to be absolutely kind to them, but he doesn't seem to have a problem with genocide. So here he's posting himself somewhere in America saying, man, I am glad we stole this land, beautiful. And then after police found 150 skulls at a crime scene in Mexico, turns out the victims, mostly women, were decapitated over 1,000 years ago. And he writes, Jesus. Thank God the conquistadors conquered this barbaric civilization. And of course, if you have read about the colonization of the New World by the Spanish and Portuguese, just like how the English and French colonized North America, it's insanely brutal genocide. Just read about Christopher Columbus, who is celebrated in America to this day, and you just feel sick, right? So many Africans were worked to death in the most brutal conditions you can imagine. So many native peoples were genocided by these Europeans, and Matt Walsh turns around and says, I'm glad we did that. I'm glad we did genocide because Europeans are superior. Therefore...
Is this bitch trying to talk to us?
for
Some
natives
fucking
deserve to be
idiot
killed
talk
in
us
massive
in the game.
amounts, and Africans as well, to create these countries like Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, all the rest of it. How is that different from Nazi rhetoric, right? How is that different from Nazi saying, oh yeah, we killed millions and millions of Jewish people, Slavs, Romani people, all this, just to create a better German Reich. And they deserved it because Germans are superior. Again, like literally Nazi rhetoric, fascist rhetoric. But don't worry, he does elaborate on this more in video form. It's not just tweets. He does actually say this out loud. And apparently the Daily Wire don't care. The Daily Wire do not care about having someone who espouses Nazi rhetoric on their platform.
Was a good thing they did. The conquest and colonization and
named
settling
it.
of this land was overall a good
Damn,
and
look at the
noble and
damage. Our people aren't doing any DPS. I'm a fucking tank. I'm a wall. Stand behind me. They're not doing anything.
courageous
Jesus.
thing.
You guys suck
It is
balls.
good.
I
that it
wouldn't-
happened,
that's why we
and
fucking
we should be
died.
grateful for it. The people who came here and claimed this land were heroes. It was heroic. And they were heroes not because of the other good stuff, but because they came and claimed it. For hundreds of years, this would not have been controversial to say. It would have been perhaps the least controversial thing to say.
Well, yeah, it's because we didn't give a fuck back then. Bro, kill this kid. He's so overextended, bro. Are you kidding me?
And now you're not allowed to say it at all.
There
But
we
I
go.
will anyway.
Suck a pussy.
But the colonization that brought Europeans to this part of the world hundreds of years ago, that was good. Not everything that happened during those many centuries was good, obviously. History is not that simple. People can commit evil in the pursuit of a worthwhile goal. That happens all the time. But and nobody would ever say that the conquerors and colonizers of this land were perfect angels. But we should celebrate them, and we should celebrate what they achieved.
I don't know about
This is
that.
the absurd rabbit hole that you fall down whenever you try to claim that the U.S. stole the land it currently occupies.
We did.
In order for a thing to be stolen, it must
Skill
first
issue,
be
am I right?
owned. But if you say that the most recent Indian tribe who lived on it owned it, then you're legitimizing conquest. And if you legitimize conquest, then there's no reason why the United
Bro, it's just like, just be a person. Just acknowledge that, like, we did a shitty thing and we should just not do those bad things anymore. And that we are where we are, for better or for worse. And, like, we just got to move forward as a fucking Americans. Like, it's not, it doesn't need to be that fucking deep. I mean, Jesus Christ. All right, pussies. That's fucking crazy.
States' conquest should not be considered legitimate.
Damn, I got 2 kills.
As I've argued many times, conquest was the way of the world, all over the world, everywhere, among all people for
shit,
thousands of
Chris.
years. If you wanted it, you took it.
Yeah.
If you wanted to keep it, you defended it. If you couldn't defend it, you
And now we know that that's wrong, so we don't do it anymore. At least not as much, right? Damn, that guy just ulted like a big goober. That's it. That's how deep it is. That's how deep it is. Like, do you want to be conquested, guys? No. Oh, so let's not do conquest anymore. It's bad stuff. Bad stuff.
you lost it. If you couldn't take it, you didn't get it. As simple as that. America didn't invent this concept. We didn't even practice the most brutal form of it. Not even close. Today, we're simply blamed because we were better at it. Americans played the exact same game that the Indians played. They observed the exact same rule of conquest, a brutal rule, but a universal one. And they were just better at it. They won. And now we're supposed to be ashamed of that victory and weep
Yes,
over it and
a little bit.
apologize centuries later. But apologize to who? The conquerors who were conquered? The thieves who had their stolen goods stolen? That's absurd. I, for one, apologize for nothing. And I'm ashamed of nothing. And I'm happy that America is here. And I'm happy that it won that conflict and that war.
I mean,
I'm
I'm happy America's here too, man. But like, I still realize that those were bad things that we did. Doesn't have to be that deep. Oh, I just accidentally turned that off. I'm a fucking goober. So
That this civilization is here. I would rather live in this civilization, and I think everyone would, including the Lakota man, B.A. But anyone who is ashamed of America is free to leave.
So when I say this is actual Nazi rhetoric, I'm not exaggerating even in the slightest. This is actual Nazi rhetoric. If we apply this to what the Nazis actually did, let's take this back to like 1943, all the territory that the Germans held in Europe, genociding whoever they pleased, right? Through this logic,
What's this
Matt
dumb
Walsh
bitch
wouldn't have a
saying?
problem with Germans saying they're proud of that. Oh, we won. This was the laws of the battlefield, and we beat the Polish, and we beat the French, and we beat the Czechs. We beat all these people, so it's ours. It's ours now. And they conquered people in the past. They've conquered other places. Not everyone who lived in Czechoslovakia was a native person there, so therefore we've won, and we can do as we please now, because that's what he's saying. He's saying that he's not ashamed of anything they did, because once they won, then what happened afterwards, Matt Walsh? They didn't just win and the natives went somewhere else.
Fuck, I should have
They
looked at
won,
this.
kept expanding, and then set out a policy, a governmental policy of extermination, right? This isn't like the colonization of Iceland, where like Irish monks went there and tried to set up a monastery, or Scandinavian people went there and settled the land and stuff, and there was no one else there. There was no one else.
yeah, we went there. We fucking destroyed those motherfuckers. Based, am I right? No, I'm just kidding. Not based. But yeah, it's obviously not just different than we kind of just went there for a little to have a little bit of tea. I don't know.
Around. This is nothing like this. They went there, set up their own countries, and began to kill people who had lived there for thousands of years. Just because native groups had fought each other doesn't mean you can go over there, kill them, make them second-class citizens in your own country, and of course exterminate most of the population in one of the worst genocides in modern history. And he's saying, who do you apologize to? Natives are still treated like shit by the US government. This slow genocide is still going on against native groups in Canada and the US. So of course,
how?
Even if you're not...
I'm just wondering how. I wonder how, but like, like nowadays, I'm truly curious. I am, because part of me, because I don't know that much, so I could just be being ignorant, but part of it seems like there is a lack of a desire to acclimate to our society, which I can understand, you know, because we're assholes historically, but it leads to like lower ability to get as good of education, you know, since there's like internal education programs, and maybe that's not the indigenous people's fault. I could be very ignorant, but that lack of wanting to acclimate could be a little bit difficult as well, but I could just not know shit.
Not the people responsible for doing it because you grew up in America in the 2000s or late 1900s. You still go about trying to address the terrible things the colonialists did and stealing this land and poisoning the land, killing any way these people could live. This is literally Nazi rhetoric. Like I said, Hitler would admire this. Hitler would agree 100% of this. He actually did agree with this rhetoric because so many people back in the day, like Matt Walsh outlines, this wasn't controversial to say. And Hitler admired that it wasn't controversial. Killing millions of people to create your own extremely racist country, which was designed to enrich a class of slave owners. Yeah, Hitler liked that, probably surprising nobody, and then he emulated it himself in Eastern Europe. What's amazing to me as well, he's saying it's an overall good thing. And what good did this even create as well? Like, even if we're going to take the whole sum of American history and say, well, the history is brutal, the history is terrible, what the Americans did to African people, to Native people, to even Asian people was reprehensible. But now we have this amazing country where everyone thrives and America is a massive force for good in the world. No, what happened is they created one of the most evil countries in the world on the backs of genocide and slavery. So there's nothing redeeming about the settling of America at all, unless you're an actual Nazi, unless you're an actual fascist who believes creating a crazy capitalist state which exports its ideology around the world through actual war and genocide is a good thing. But again, if you're a fascist, you do believe this. But just on the point he was saying that this wouldn't be controversial 100 years ago, because of course it wouldn't be controversial for white supremacists in a fascist state to say that colonization was good. But this has actually been part of the mainstream conservative movement for a while. So you guys...
That was going to be such a good ult, bro. I just feel like I didn't get any backup on that.
Guys all know, a lot of these people love Ayn Rand for, you know, one reason or another. Maybe they don't like her views on objectivism so much, but they like her views generally on capitalism. And Ayn Rand actually said something very, very similar, which I want to read to you. So Ayn Rand speaking about racism, slavery, and Native Americans at West Point in 1974. So imagine Matt Walsh is saying this, or imagine Matt Walsh's reaction to Ayn Rand here. But now, as to the Indians, I don't even care to discuss that kind of alleged complaints that they have against this country. I do believe, with serious scientific reasons, the worst kind of movie that you have probably seen, worse from an Indian viewpoint, as to what they did to the white man. I do not think they have any right to live in a country merely because they were born here and acted and lived like savages. Americans didn't conquer. Americans did not conquer that country. In other words, once respect for the rights of Indians, who incidentally, for most cases of their tribal history, made agreements with the white man, and when they had used up whichever they got through agreement of giving,
I didn't realize we're in overtime.
Selling certain territory, then came back and broke the agreements and attacked white settlements. I will go further. Let's suppose they were all beautifully innocent savages, which they certainly were not. What was it they were fighting for if they opposed white men on this continent? For their wish to continue a primitive existence, their right to keep part of the earth untouched, unused, and not even as property. That's such a bad thing. But just keep everybody out so you will live practically like an animal.
I just don't understand why this needs to be said by these people. Like, this just sounds like you don't want Native people to exist with you. It's like you're just fucking being a crybaby. Like, it's okay to say, like, oh, like, I acknowledge your struggle, but we can't change things. Like, we can't give your land back. But it sucks. That's all you really have to say. That's like it's like, hey guys, say sorry, bro. We can't give it back. But I understand that it would be, we you know, historically we fucked you guys up a bit, you know. So let's try to make things even. You know, maybe I'll give you a couple of, you know, I'll give you a couple of Nike Shocks, Nike Airs, and you guys stop. You know, maybe we're all good. You know, something, you know,
or maybe a few caves about. Any white person who brings the elements of civilization had the right to take over this continent. And it is great that some people did, and discovered here what they couldn't do anywhere else in the world, and what the Indians, if there are any racist Indians today, do not believe to this day: respect for individual rights. And then, of course, nicely to link the genocide of natives to the conquest of Palestine, I am incidentally in favor of Israel against the Arabs for the same reason. There you have the same issue in reverse. But why do the Arabs resent it? Because it is a wedge of civilization in part of a continent which is totally primitive and nomadic. Israel is being attacked for being civilized and being specifically a technological society. It's for that very reason that they should be supported, that they are morally right because they represent the progress of man's mind. Just as the white settlers of America represented
Did they go over the wall?
Mind, not centuries of brute stagnation and superstition. They represented the banner of the mind, and they were in the right. So, of course, insanely fascist rhetoric, just like Matt Walsh, the belief that people deserve to be killed and genocided because they aren't as superior or technological as you are. And you see how these people justify fascism to themselves. They think, oh, you know, like Matt Walsh was saying, I'm glad we ended the civilization. I'm glad we killed all the natives because they were barbarians. Ayn Rand saying the same thing. I'm glad we killed all the natives. And what's so fascinating here is the cognitive dissonance of white settlers and the government literally killed millions of these people in the most brutal ways. And they're the ones to talk about being civilized. Being civilized is doing genocide, right? Apparently.
It's a good point. It's not super duper civilized to do genocides. That's a good point. But it is interesting that you're saying that other people are uncivilized while, you know, engaging in genocide. But they're just going to say that, like, oh, we basically just killed a bunch of, that's what they're saying, that we genocided a bunch of animals. That's what they think of the indigenous people when it really boils down to what they believe. So that's pretty fucked shit, bro.
Where caring for the land and not destroying it for capitalism is worthy of that genocide, right? If you're not developing it for economic gain or individual property rights, you must be killed, according to Ayn Rand and Matt Walsh. Again, how people can even argue that modern American conservatism and people like Matt Walsh aren't actual fascists is actually amazing. But on that note as well, this is Ayn Rand saying it, this is Matt Walsh saying it, and like I said, America has not had to reckon.
Yeah, for me, when it comes down to it, it's like some of it I think is just intentionally trying to be provocative, like, oh, I'm so cool, I'm so fucking base, because people get rewarded for being like antagonistic little fuckboys on the internet, you know?
With its past as a whole country. Lots of people listen. There are loads of good Americans, don't worry. I don't think you're all like Matt Walsh, but there's a reason this rhetoric is not seen as like extremely fringe or extremely fascistic, and it's because it still is in the mainstream. Like Matt Walsh can say that, and any repercussions? None. No one in conservative circles care. If you look at the replies to the tweet, he both doubles down, and loads of people are agreeing with him. So clearly, people in America still believe this fascist rhetoric. They still agree with genocide because they haven't had to confront what the reality of what this was. And it's no wonder when you have people defending it like that. Hitler was himself inspired by the genocide of the natives, and he wanted to do his own manifest destiny in Eastern Europe. So let's get into this. So on waging non-violence, how Hitler found a blueprint for a German empire by looking to the American West. Adolf Hitler and his regime consciously drew on US actions towards the Native Americans as a model for their murderous campaign in Eastern Europe during World War II. This is a connection explored by recent historians of Nazi Germany and detailed most...
Like, how do they know he legitimately did it? I wonder if this was like a recent discovery. Is this real?
Comprehensively in Carol Kakel's The American West and the Nazi East. Hitler's overriding strategic goal in launching World War II was stretching Germany's borders eastward to encompass most of Europe. This quest for...
Why are these people so overextended? Anyway, the only reason I asked that is because, like, it's possible that there was an actual legitimate connection nowadays to it. But I'm curious about if that's true, because I feel like nowadays we filter things in such a weird, like, fucking like way that, like, I'm a little did we actually find something, or was there like somebody who wanted to find something like that? Fuck, I'm just gonna ult because I want to get rid of it.
The Lebensraum, or living space, to the east was his central preoccupation. He envisioned a vast German empire extending through the Baltics, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, all the way to the Ural Mountains. The empire would be gradually cleared of its former inhabitants and populated instead by rugged, self-reliant German farmers growing food to feed a great continental power. And of course, you can see lots of parallels with settler colonialism wherever you find it, from Ireland to Israel. This is why the United States was Hitler's chief inspiration. It was, according to the Holocaust historian Timothy Snyder, the exemplary land empire on which the Nazis based their vision of colonizing Eastern Europe. What did Hitler see when he looked to America for inspiration? After pioneering settler colonialism in Ireland, the British brought it to North America with devastating effect as colonists displaced indigenous inhabitants. These same colonists made more rapid westward expansion a primary justification for the Revolutionary War against Britain, citing it specifically in the Declaration of Independence. Indeed, one of the largest military actions of the war was the Continental Army's attack on the Iroquois Confederation after George Washington ordered the total destruction and devastation of their settlements, so they would be driven out by terror. The American military established its patterns for the next century by expelling native people from their homeland through a campaign of brutally indiscriminate violence. After independence, Thomas Jefferson popularized his vision of an agrarian empire of virtuous yeoman farmers. As for what he called the doomed red race, Jefferson wrote that those not willing to leave would be exterminated or driven beyond the Mississippi. Their methods included mass shootings, rape, burned villages, destroyed food supplies, and forced marches. The result was rapid depopulation by murder.
It's interesting how recent these things happen, because like you always get this impression that like we're just trying to be good guys. I think that's so interesting. I feel like a lot of this framing is just like we have this concept of our framing, that like we've always tried to do the right thing. We came to America to like make a better life for everybody, but like we didn't really do that. That's a very like a new age concept of that. That seems to be a very new concept that we're trying to be good guys now, you know?
Starvation, disease, exposure, and expulsion. So as an 1854 article in De Beau's Review put it about the natives and the justification for manifest destiny, their race is run and they're gradually disappearing to give place to a higher order of human beings. Yeah. Does that sound like Matt Walsh, and does that sound like Ayn Rand? Andrew Jackson viewed Native Americans as a disease that was constantly infesting our frontier and needed eradication. All of this makes it unsurprising that in looking for a blueprint for Europe, for the European...
You know what I think is a crime? I just thought about this now. Yeah, you guys, like, I don't know, this is like a man thing, right? So women might not get it, but as a man, I've always had like a bucket list, like, oh, I want to fuck like a, you know, like a fucking, you know, I've like a bunch of different types of girls, you know, but I've never had like indigenous girl. I've never had some of that like indigenous punani on there, you know, and it's like, damn, why not? It's what a shame, you know. Why didn't I want to? I feel so bad, you know. Got to add that to the bucket list. I will never hit it because I'm married now. But you know what I mean? Fellas, add indigenous pussy to that list. Okay? That's because let's think about it. Let's be real here. Men, you know, men value people based on if they're going to fuck them. So if more people wanted to fuck indigenous girls, there'd be less oppression for indigenous people. It's the truth. It's the truth, brother. It's the truth.
East, Hitler found it in the American West. In Snyder's words, the American example was one of the source mythologies of the Nazi Eastern Project. Hitler grew up reading Karl May's American Western novels for young people, which featured tales of taming the Wild West through Indian wars. He also regularly reread them into adulthood, even recommending them to his generals as sources of creative ideas. Writing in Mein Kampf...
It's not me trying to colonize. Think about this. Imagine that you're the white settler, and you got an indigenous girlfriend, right? You're like, oh, that's colonization. For who? Think about it. In America, we're so racist that anytime that there's somebody mixed with anything other than white, they're not white anymore. You know, half black and white, you're black. You're light-skinned. So really, who's colonizing whom? If you get deep in that spiritual puss. Think about that. You got to put that in your brain. Put that in your brain, okay? So, you know, ladies, start getting that white dick.
1920s, Hitler praised the way that
we're not letting them win.
Conquered its own continent by clearing the soil of natives to make room for a more racially pure settlers and lay the foundation for its economic self-sufficiency and growing global power. Indeed, the concept of Lebensraum was coined and popularized by Friedrich Razzle, who said his theory of colonization and racial replacement drew inspiration from the American historian Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis and its identification of colonization of the Great West as central to American history and identity. Once the Nazis gained power in Germany, Kakel details how the American West became an obsession for Hitler and his closest followers, such as Heinrich Himmler. Their goal was to remake the demographics of Europe the same way the US remade the demographics of North America. The Nazi leadership routinely referred to Eastern Europe as the German East or the Wild East, and its inhabitants as Indians, admiring how the United States had gunned down millions of Redskins to a few 100,000 and now kept the modest remnant under observation in a cage. Hitler spoke of his intention to similarly Germanize the East by immigration of Germans to look upon the natives as Redskins. Echoing American justifications for westward settlement, he stated, "It is inconceivable that a higher people should painfully exist on a soil too narrow for it, while amorphous masses which contribute nothing to civilization occupy infinite tracts of a soil that is one of the richest in the world. Here in the East, a similar process will repeat itself for the second time as in the conquest of America. For Hitler, our Mississippi must be the Volga." So we've seen Hitler's own ideology towards this stuff, his own inspiration from the American genocide of the native populations. Does anything that Matt Walsh, Ayn Rand, and Hitler say really contradict each other? The only difference is Hitler's trying to replicate the genocide. But ideologically, I don't see much of a difference between these three people in how they view native peoples. Like Matt Walsh said it's good that all these native peoples were genocided because they are barbarians. Ayn Rand says the same thing. Hitler says the same thing. And then Hitler starts saying about other peoples in Europe, right? What's the difference here? There is no difference. They're all fascist. They all believe in a fascist justification.
I don't know who Rand is, but if you think about it, Hitler and Matt Walsh are both very feminine men. So it makes sense that they would be into genocide because they probably couldn't really fight themselves. So they got to be like, oh, look at everybody else. They're so bad. And Indigenous people are so bad. I'm so feminine. Oh, guys, look, they're so bad. I'm not bad. Look at the bad people. You know what I mean? I don't really know where I'm going here. It's like a weird joke, but I was giving it a shot. You miss 100% of the shots you'll take, you know?
For killing millions upon millions of people based on their own views of their racial superiority. Remember, Matt Walsh is a guy who talks about the death of the Anglo-Saxon race.
And that's what's happening with us. The extinction of the Anglo-Saxon
This is literally destiny, you guys. What the fuck are you talking about?
race is just like that.
You don't
The fuck is an Anglo-Saxon, bro? I hate math. What the fuck? Fucking Anglo-Saxon? Relating to or denoting the Germanic inhabitants of England from their arrival in the 5th century up to the Norman conquest. Oh, this sounds like they're kind of mixed, Nordic and English. So who gives a shit? The fuck?
don't get more racist than that. Like, even in 1920 in The Great Gatsby, the guy who talks about that shit is seen as the villain in 1920. And then we have a guy today, in 2016 he said this, and then in 2023 saying, yeah, the founding of America was a good thing, so that means, I guess, genociding millions and millions of people
is based.
was worth it, I guess. And like I said, the fact he feels comfortable saying this stuff, the fact that there's no repercussions, and the fact that loads of conservatives are agreeing with him shows that fundamentally the American conservative movement still promotes the fascist justification for genocide, which inspired Hitler himself to do something similar himself. And Americans as a society have never had to reconcile with this, so people can just say it. And he's saying hundreds and hundreds of years ago, people could just say that. Yeah, they could. They were also genocidal monsters as well. Like, do you want to be like Thomas Jefferson? Do you want to be like Andrew Jackson? Do you want to be like the white settlers who did all this terrible shit? Do you want to be like the people who inspired Nazi Germany and Hitler? I guess you actually do, because it seems like every word that comes out of your mouth that I read is advocating for some sort of violence or genocide. So there we go. That is Matt Walsh from the Daily Wire, basically having the same talking points about the conquest of America as Ayn Rand and as Adolf Hitler. We could do a whole video about how America just inspired, like, everything to do with the Nazis, including its eugenics program, including its legal system. Nazi judges literally came over to America in the 30s to study the legal code because it was so extensive about how it categorized people based on race and how it treated people based on race. The only other comparable system was in South Africa. The American one was more extensive, so they chose that. So I could talk about all those things, but I want to move on now. And obviously Matt Walsh is also infamous for being an insane transphobe. But recently, Michael Knowles talked about eradicating transgenderism from public life. Got very butthurt.
Yeah, I saw that. Like, I think people interpret it as like, he's like, no, we just have to get rid of the concept of trans people, because, like, you know, he thinks that all trans people only exist because we acknowledge the concept of transgenderism. But it definitely comes off as trying to I mean, how else do you get rid of transgender people? You gotta genocide them. You know, I guess if I'm being generous to him, he was really more talking about getting rid of the ideology, because that creates more trans people. But okay.
When he got called out that he was advocating for a genocide of transgender people. But what is even the difference? If we're getting rid of transgenderism, there's no transgender people. So how do you actually go about doing that? You legally stop people from getting the medical treatment if they want it to be transgender, and you make it illegal to be transgender. And what do you do with the people who are transgender then? You lock them up? Do you kill them? What do you do? So let's have a look at this clip before talking
I
about...
guess they end up taking their own lives because they don't have the option. I don't know.
The Nazis' own views on transgender people and, by extension, the LGBT community.
There can be no middle way in dealing with transgenderism. It is all or nothing. If transgenderism is true, if men really can become women, then it's true for everybody of all ages. If transgenderism is false, as it is, if men really can't become women, as they cannot...
Well, I mean, like, the perspective is like men can't become women, right? Trans women are women. They were, like, born in the wrong body in some capacity, so they're not becoming anything. They're just kind of living their authentic selves. So.
Then it's false for everybody, too. And if it's false, then we should not indulge it. Especially since that indulgence...
But, like, the problem is that it is true. Like, you could disagree, you could dislike trans people, but it's, like, something that's very well studied by mental health professionals and other medical health experts. So we're at a point now where, like, we have to be, like, I understand if you disagree, and that's perfectly fine, and we could all have conversations about it, but we really should get to the point where we just kind of acknowledge that, like, it is trans people are an objective truth, and there's more evidence that trans people exist than God exists. And so I think it's kind of dishonest for religious individuals to sit here and say it's not true, facts don't care about your feelings, when you support religion. And I love God, but which one is more factual? It's the trans person. So, you know, if you can believe there's a magical man in the sky, why can't somebody believe that they were born in the wrong body. You know what I mean? It doesn't really make any sense. You know, I feel like the more intense thing is God. It's more religion. That's a more absurd thing when you kind of retract and look at it objectively. So kind of makes sense to be like, oh, that makes sense. You know, I think we have to obviously have conversations about, you know, what it means for trans women to exist, you know, in like sports. I get that. But like it's a fact. That's where we're at here. So
requires taking away the rights and customs of so many people. If it is false, then for the good of society, and especially for the good of the poor people who have fallen prey to this confusion, transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely.
Look at all the claps.
Preposterous ideology at every level.
So
how many conversations do you think they had about helping poor people? 0 probably. What should we do to help poor people? Let's move on to trans people. That seems to be the only real conversation that's had. But okay, interesting.
Interesting to know about the insane anti-trans movement in America and the UK is they always focus on men trying to become women, right? They're always focusing on that. And I think that's an important thing to note. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind because fascism is an extreme pro-patriarchy ideology. So in that pro-patriarchy ideology, you have very, very rigid gender roles and gender norms. And in fascism, it is this ultra-conservative view that men do everything, men lead everything, men are in charge of everything, women are all wives and mothers, and that's it, right? And fascism is an extreme masculine ideology. So what do they see as men becoming women? They see men who are like sexual degenerates, or they see men who are becoming effeminate.
That's actually like true. There's like something like Jordan Peterson and a bunch of other conservatives. There's some kind of sexual fetish apparently where men want to become women. I don't even know if it's true or it's real or if that's just like a misdiagnosis of trans people. But they think that all like trans women are just men that want to dress up as women for like some kind of sexual shit. And it's like, you guys are so fucking bizarre. You know, talk to a mental health professional so you can understand these things, you silly goose, you know?
By choice, and they're indulging in some sort of degenerate gender ideology, and that has no place in fascism. You cannot have men becoming women in this society because it completely goes against the core tenets of fascism. And Michael Knowles is some ultra-Catholic conservative weirdo, so I'm not surprised he really subscribes to this ideology. Catholicism has historically been in bed with fascism, but beyond that, he is basically calling for the eradication of transgenderism, meaning transgender people. He says transgender people can't exist. He says transgender people shouldn't be able to exist, right? And even with this trans panic, if you know anything about gender historically, the Western gender binary is not something universal to humanity. There's been so many societies where gender is way more fluid and flexible. I said this before, even in places like Pakistan, which have extreme anti-gay laws and anti-LGBT laws as a whole, there are transgender people. In certain Asian countries, like Thailand, there is historically a different view on gender fluidity.
Yeah, they call them ladyboys. Oh, they like to be called that, apparently. It's crazy. It's like a whole culture. They're like, yeah, these are based. It's fucking crazy, dude.
And the gender binary. And this happens in a lot of societies across Europe as well in the ancient period. So all this really comes from a fascist Christian view of gender. And they see anything to do with this as subversive. They see any man who wants to pretend to be a woman as a threat to their ideology. And also, of course, all this trans panic goes in with some sort of groomer panic as well, because they feel like the left are indoctrinating kids in sexual ideology. Because again,
yeah, and part of me doesn't even, I don't even know if that's real. Like, I used to be like, yeah, because I understand when it comes to kids, like making sure you make the right choice, but I think that it's all just like virtue signaling about grooming. I don't think that they actually give a fuck about kids, because when it comes to a kid getting, you know, shot to death in a church, or excuse me, well, even in a church, anywhere, they're like, no, we can't do anything about it because of my freedoms. But like when it comes to like a kid seeing a fucking drag person read something to them, they're crying and shitting and coming. Right? But then when it comes to, again, some kind of like a fucking, you know, beauty pageant, they're all jerking off to little kids like fucking dressed up disgustingly. I don't think that these people care. I think that like I think it's really just about not liking trans people more than anything else. So
again, they're trying to link the LGBT community to something inherently terrible like pedophilia and stuff. Let's just not talk about, you know, all the nonces and pedos in the Catholic Church, which Michael Knowles is a part of, by the way. So when I say this as like actual Nazi rhetoric, not just fascist rhetoric, it's actually playing into like actual Nazi ideology. We have to go back to Nazi Germany itself, and we have to see, how did the Nazis treat transgender people? And some of you might say, There weren't any transgender people 100 years ago. How could there be? Transgenderism, according to Michael Knowles, was invented like 10 years ago. But let's get into this. It's obviously a very overlooked part of the Holocaust.
Obviously, there was more. There's obviously more people. We call them masking. Not being like explicitly trans.
Overlooked part of the rise of the Nazis. So LGBTQ Institute in Germany was burned down by the Nazis on January 30th.
They had to hide more because it was less acceptable.
1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. His rise to power ushered in Nazi control of the country and led to the horrors of the Holocaust. Among those targeted by the Third Reich were lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people. LGBTQ people would be sent to concentration camps alongside the Jews, the disabled, and many more. On May 6, 1933, Nazi demonstrators raided the libraries of the Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft, a German name that roughly translates to the Institute of Sexology. The institute was privately operated research space for studies of human sexuality. More than 20,000 books were taken from the shelves and burned days later in the streets by Nazi youth groups. It was a devastating blow to the life work of Magnus Hirschfeld, the institute's founder. Hirschfeld, who was Jewish and gay, was a pioneer for rights and liberation in Berlin's thriving LGBTQ community. He founded the institute in 1919 after beginning his career as an activist in 1896 with his pamphlet Sappho and Socrates about a gay man who took his own life after he felt he'd been coerced into a straight marriage. Hirschfeld's early publications laid the groundwork for his profile to rise until he became one of the most prominent LGBTQ activists in the world. He even co-wrote one of the first gay characters to appear in film in 1919's Different from the Others. Hirschfeld's well-known name gave him the chance to intervene on behalf of at least one transgender woman arrested for female impersonation. That woman went on to become one of the several who had the chance to take advantage of the Institute's pioneering gender affirmation surgeries. The Nazis' destruction of the Institute's library destroyed all the medical records, which contained detailed notes about the nuances of the complicated procedures, alongside untold volumes of thought stories and studies on LGBTQ people. Hitler himself called Hirschfeld Jewish swine, and the Institute's events and speaking engagements were frequently marred by heckling, stink bombs, and so on, according to Simon LeVay's 1996 book, Queer Science. So around 10 to 15,000 LGBT people were sent to concentration camps, murdered, experimented on by Nazi doctors. But what I just read you there about Hirschfeld and this institute, do you think Michael Knowles would object if a bunch of Republican youths went to a transgender clinic anywhere, let's say LA, and maybe burn it down, went in there saying they were protecting whatever and destroyed the...
No, I think that they would be okay with that if they can get away with it. Honestly, that's a good point. Like, truly, I think that if they can get away with it, they would do that kind of shit. So, yeah, okay, fair enough.
Work of the people there. Do you think when Michael Knowles talks about eradicating transgenderism, he would agree with similar actions to what the Nazis did to transgender research and clinics in Nazi Germany? Are you seriously going to tell me when someone espouses rhetoric like this, they wouldn't agree what the Nazis did? And as we see with TERF movements around the world, recently in Australia, the TERF movements who describe themselves as like liberal feminists wanting to protect women, they're marching around with Nazis giving Hitler salutes, right? Because these movements are aligning on their views on gender. And that's what I mean when I say the history of the Holocaust of Nazi Germany is taught so poorly, because these people are actually realizing now, oh yeah, I actually agree with the Nazis. I'm a TERF. I agree with what the Nazis did to institutes like we just read about. I agree with how they treated transgender people. I'm Michael Knowles, this Catholic fascist, and I want to eradicate transgenderism. Well, if you want to eradicate transgenderism, wouldn't you be doing similar attacks to what the Nazis did to the institute we just read about? Of course you would. And here you see two prime examples of people saying genocidal rhetoric or saying genocides are good, and they work for mainstream conservative outlets. How many mainstream news networks have Matt Walsh and Michael Knowles appeared on over the years? Every single conservative one. They have a popular show on the biggest conservative network on YouTube, right? Probably get paid millions of pounds a year. We saw Stephen Crowder got offered $50 million for 4 years, right? So these people
wild.
Not only are being accepted.
And then he cried about it and wouldn't take it. What a fucking baby, am I right, guys? What a piss baby.
They're being paid to spout fascist Nazi propaganda on some of the biggest conservative networks. So how can anyone argue to me the mainstream conservative movement is not only fascist in like a modern sense, in like a Western chauvinist sense that fits in with 2023, it's also a movement that is happy enough to repeat Nazi propaganda, Nazi arguments for genocide, which they then frame as good. Is anyone seriously going to argue with me, centrist, conservative, libertarian, leftist, that American conservatism isn't a fascist movement? It is a fascist movement. I tweeted this the other day. The reason we do not have massive emergences of far-right fringe parties in the UK and the US is because the mainstream conservative movement in our countries fulfills that desire.
Yeah, honestly, yeah, I mean, it's hard to disagree with that. It really is with some of the crazy shit that's going on. And I feel like the reason that we don't necessarily, listen, the average person is going to listen to this and be like, okay, whatever. Like, because they're going to be like, I think trans people are weird too. But I think that's just like our social conditioning being like, yeah, it's not that big of a deal. People are like, I honestly think that most people are just like, whatever. I would say, I like to believe most people are like, yeah, or most conservatives, they think that trans people are weird, but for the most part, they're just like, whatever, not that big of a deal. That also might just be something that's like local to me because I live in New York, and more conservatives are just more normal. So just like, yeah, it's whatever. They just don't care. But I don't know. Maybe it's part of it's like a downplay because they're fucking crazy now. There's literally nothing else except anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. Everybody's so fucking like worked up over everybody's so worked up over all this shit. It's fucking wild. Like there's nothing else going on in the party. And so, I think things are getting worse and worse. Truly speaking, I think it has to do Donald Trump got like elected, and this shit happened. A lot of good Republicans decided to walk away. It was a huge thing. Like for a while, Republicans were just like, yeah, we can't be part of this anymore. They just decided to retire and shit. So, it makes sense that the Republican Party's fucking bonkers now. I think everybody's kind of realizing it more than anything else. Nowadays, as things are going way too far. At least I like to think that they are. But I really do think that people are realizing it, that things are going way too far, because people are waking up and like, yeah, what else do they talk about? What else do fucking conservatives talk about?
Why would you even join the American Nazi Party when you have the American Republican Party? Like, the only thing the mainstream Republican Party disagrees with the America First movement, which is like a Nazi movement, is that they support Israel. But they don't support Israel because they believe in the rights to a Jewish homeland. They support Israel out of some insane evangelical belief it's the key to Armageddon where all Jews will die. But other than that, America First, the mainstream Republican movement, fascists, they all agree with each other on like 90% of things. And in the UK, the Tory party basically did a deal with like the far-right parties movement for them to stand down because they would basically enact their agenda. And that's why in the UK, we have the Tory party going fascist in their own way. And that's really taken steam out of any like full fascist movement in the UK generally. We have these Western chauvinist fascist movements. And in America explicitly, we have like these genocidal movements which happily call for genocide or celebrate genocide. And if they had their way, they'd enact it. Michael Knowles would be happy if American Republican youth went around to transgender clinics and burnt them down and destroyed them. How can you say otherwise when he's talking about eradicating
If he can get away with it, I think he would be chilling on it, so.
Transgenderism entirely. So anyway, that is it for the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.
All right, interesting.